All right, so we have a few minutes left here. Let's open it up to the group. I'm sure we've sparked some robust thoughts out there. We have microphones around. Mark's ready to fire away.
He's on sabbatical. He's
Sean?
not supposed to ask questions.
Okay, so a quick question, and the answer may not be quite as short. So a couple of the variations on for changes to the auditor's reporting model have probably, my guess is not as much legs, like the auditors, this notion of auditors discussion and analysis. So what I'm curious about, that's probably not going to manifest, but what I'm curious about is that a type of discussion that you want to have between auditors and audit committee members, for example? In other words, or even the more extreme version of this would have been then Chairman Barandino from Anderson, after the series of alleged frauds, let's put it that way. His story was the auditor's report. Why couldn't that have been even a letter grade? And what I'm wondering, when auditors have discussions with audit committee members, either in meetings or before meetings, do you want and do you get, and is that part of what's changed in the last decade, more frank discussions about the key estimates, tough judgment calls? In other words, maybe it's not the auditor's report where this conversation ultimately will end up, but maybe it is in this exchange between management, auditors, and audit committee members. That's basically the question.
I'll take the first stab. Mark, it's probably no surprise that the most interesting and relevant part of what we communicate to an audit committee, and I communicate, is not the SAS 61 or the ASS 14 or now AS 16 letter. It's really, audit committees really want to know what I think. I've been told that and extracted that in a lot of different ways, and they really want to know my observations about things. And I think accountants in general, I think it's probably a DNA thing that we're good at stating the facts, explaining what the literature says, and here's what happened. But they sometimes want to know how we connected the dots. And so I think that's the most important thing that I can provide when I'm providing this standard and its required communications, is to fill in the dots with what you might call an ADA. But it's really describing where we struggled, where it wasn't easy, where it was a close call. You know, I think that's what audit committees want from us.
And I think that happens in two ways. I think one happens in the actual audit committee meeting itself, but I think the more robust discussion sometimes happens between the lead partner and the audit committee chair in our meetings, in between meetings, either on the phone, either telephonically or in person. That's where I get a lot of those types of discussions.
In private sessions as well.
Private sessions as well, yes.
Totally agree. I think that last point is key. One audit committee chair known to work with, one of the questions would be, are there any harebrained ideas that financial management came up with that we never saw because you killed it first?
Right.
I mean, it's an interesting question.
It really is.
So I mean, some of our best work is done, and it's so invisible to the outside, certainly even to the audit committee. But I do think, I've got one client that actually asked for an oral AD&A ahead of the quarter. I've got one other that we do something that's sort of, bullets or, kind of a quasi-written version. But that is where the value happens, and that's why even a great audit committee report can't really capture the feeling of that or the effectiveness of that dialogue.
Right, totally agree.
Parveen, you had a question? Oh, I'm sorry.
This conversation, of course, is focused on audit committee and is strengthening this audit committee, but audit committee is only a link in the governance chain from management to external auditors, internal auditors, and audit committee. When we focus our attention on audit committee, it's natural, perhaps easy, to describe its functions in terms of making it stronger, making it larger, giving more resources, giving more time, some of the issues that have been discussed. However, in terms of examining its consequences for the governance of the corporation, we also need to think about the impact of transferring more responsibility to the audit committee on responsibility of the auditors, just as putting more responsibility on the auditors had impact on responsibility of the management, which ends up with the Iskilling defense. People on the top said okay, people at the bottom said okay. What do I know? I'm just a poor CEO. I just signed on the blank sheet. So what are the consequences for management, for governance of the corporations, and for the auditing profession of putting more and more of this responsibility on audit committee and shifting more of these judgments to the audit committee? What are its long-run consequences? Is this really that good a thing to make audit committees stronger? And what will happen next after this?
So let me try to restate your question to make sure that I heard it correctly, because one of the questions I asked earlier was, does the audit committee have too much responsibility, or all these things that we're talking about, are they in the right place with respect to the audit committee? Are you revisiting that question and saying?
Yes, and what are its consequences for responsibilities of management and external auditors?
Okay. So I think you heard the group say, and I'm interested in other comments here, that they felt like these responsibilities belonged with the audit committee. And you guys can fill in any blanks there, but I'm interested as to what others in the audience think. Do they think that the audit committee has too many responsibilities today, back to the consequences that Shyam's bringing up now?
And as we do that, let's distinguish between oversight of making the decisions
Exactly.
and making the decisions. I mean, the oversight piece is making sure, in most cases, the financial management, internal audit, and external audit are aligned. And if one of them is not, it's time for a discussion. I think that's very different than actually taking responsibility for the decision.
Totally agree.
Good point. Other thoughts out there? Ira, were you going to comment, or are you going to ask another question? It's coming, Giselle.
It's behind you, Giselle.
We can always hear you, Ira.
Okay, thank you. I was curious about your reactions to the following. Andy Fastow's been making the rounds at universities, and he was recently out at my shop. And one of the things that he said was, with respect to his culpability for what happened at Enron, was, well, I probably pushed the envelope too far, but at the same time, all of the professionals signed off, including the local folks who are on the board. So, I did my due diligence. What's your thought about that, and how that relates to the professional judgment rule and the culpability of audit committee and board members more generally? Is it too easy for them to sign off, saying, I did what represents due diligence here. I went to the experts, I got the lawyers, I got some accountants to sign off, and that then gives me a get-out-of-jail-free card with respect to the professional judgment rule?
Well, consider the source. But, I mean, so are you persuaded that was a good faith exercise? I wasn't in that situation, but I checked with this group, I checked with that group, I did my checklist, so it must be good. It just doesn't even feel like the end of the day, it's on my shoulders to make the decision as the CFO. It feels like it's shifting blame to me. I'm not saying that those sign-offs were, I don't know what the process was, or whether they were wrong or lacked integrity, but he's now using that to say, well, I had a lot of help.
Yeah, and my follow-up to that in the context of this discussion, is it too easy for the board to get there, given that they have the protection of the professional judgment?
No, I don't think it is easy for the board or the audit committee to get there, as you say. I think as a audit committee chair and a board member, I feel a great deal of responsibility for making sure that I understand the information that's coming before me, that I ask questions, good questions to the best of my judgment, that I listen hard to what my management team is telling me and what my external auditors are telling me, and counsel, if counsel is involved or engaged in that decision. And then I try to make the best judgment that I can on whatever the issue is that's coming before me. Now, I will tell you that I do rely on the business judgment rule to protect me because I'm not always going to make perfect decisions. But if you are a board member, particularly on an audit committee, you are taking your I would say most audit committee members, and I'm sure there are some out there that aren't, but most audit committees aren't viewing it as, just something that you go there, you listen to people, you check the box, you go home and you get your check. I mean, we don't get paid enough to put our reputations nor our personal livelihoods at risk. They just don't pay me enough money for that.
Parveen, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me that what I'm hearing is that the responsibilities of the audit committees have increased considerably, particularly since the enactment of the SOX. And I just heard you say, probably for the second time, that we are not getting paid enough. And I'm not taking these risks, or so on and so forth. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what are your views in terms of perhaps the time has come since the agenda of the audit committee, or for that matter, even the compensation committees or the risk committees, is going longer and longer, that maybe we ought to consider thinking about full-time professional directors as opposed to the current model that we have? I don't know what the views of the panelists are on that.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, the value of the board, one could argue, is the fact that they fulfill an oversight role, not a management role.
Right.
A full-time director, and you see this sometime in the UK, where a chairman, independent chairman, sort of comes to work every day as the chairman. The risk there, of course, is you start sliding into a quasi-management role and you lose the objectivity that is intended for a board role. So, perhaps we should pay directors more across the board, but I would still prefer that a director spent, I don't know, 15, 20% of their time and no more, lest they just kind of get sort of sucked into the vortex of managing the company.
Yeah, I agree with that. We are not management as board members. And while I say we're not paid enough money, I also sort of look with a jaundiced eye on board members that need the board fees in order to have a livelihood. I think that is potentially a slippery slope that may cause individuals to make perhaps not quite their best judgments in order to retain their board seats. And I think we need to be independent enough of the company and hence the board fees that come with it, that you can make a hard decision or you can challenge someone. And if they choose not to re-elect you, so be it. But sort of a full-time board member, I don't know, it just doesn't seem to sit well, at least with me anyway.
No, I understand that the issues of objectivity and putting your fingers into the operations, because directors are supposed to be more like NIFO, right? Nose in and fingers out. But what is the solution? Because on one hand, we are hearing that your responsibilities, your commitments are increasing. You're being held to higher standards. More and more laws and regulations are coming. And I'm not sure, and I'm pretty sure on that you are doing what you're supposed to do, whether you're getting paid or not. So what is the solution here? How are we going to improve the quality of the overall governance from the board? Board is supposed to have the oversight responsibilities. And it is clear that the time is less. They do not have that amount of time that they need to do a good job. So what do you suggest? How do we improve this thing going forward?
One huge opportunity is to kill PowerPoints.
That should be easy to do.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times that you sit in a board meeting and have somebody, whether it's management or an external auditor or whomever, come up and they'll have PowerPoint slides and they'll click through all the stuff that was in the pre-mail, and rather than having maybe a summary slide with the one or two issues you need to discuss and sort of get to the conversation. And as a board, some of these people come before you maybe once, period. They just don't get before the board for whatever reason, whatever their job responsibilities are. And you hate to sort of chop them off at the knees and say, sort of get on with it. And so you let them sort of, and it's...
Well, it seems we have found an easy solution today. Kill the PowerPoints, right?
Yeah, you could save a lot of time, I tell you.
Now, that issue comes up constantly in surveys of boards. The mix between discussion time and presentation time. Boards are always clamoring for more discussion time. Now, I suspect in some cases that kind of transcends down to the committee level, depending on sort of the culture of how the board operates. But I would think some smart academics come up with an effectiveness formula for boards of directors so that they could actually make better use of the time they do spend, but I don't know.
We probably have time for one, maybe two more questions if they're brief. I see Joe in the back. You'll have plenty of time to get more of these thoughts down on paper after lunch. Go ahead, Joe.
A quick comment and then a question. The comment on the PowerPoints, Michelle, I chair a not-for-profit audit committee. And what I do is I tell the professional service providers, you have X amount of time for PowerPoint or presentation, and that's it, because I want to have time for Q&A. And when they hit the time, if they're not done, I cut them off. And so that generally works pretty well. They stay within the time limits. The question I have, and I want your input, Michelle, and then Bob. You made a statement, Michelle, if I heard you right, something to the effect that you think it's hard to get A players onto audit committees at smaller companies, mid-sized companies, and smaller companies.
Sometimes. I did say,
sometimes.
yes.
And I'm curious, maybe for you to elaborate on that and then have Bob talk about it. And here's where I'm coming from. I won't mention the name. But Bob and I both served with a person on the CAQ for a number of years who was a high-level accounting person at a major corporation. And this person very much wanted to be invited to the dance, and we'll call the dance serving on audit committees of public companies. And I don't think he was limited to just the very biggest. And what he said to me is generally, he's not being asked out a whole lot. That generally there's this strong preference for CEOs and CFOs, preferably sitting, but if not sitting, at least recently retired. And someone like him who was a very, very senior accounting person, let's just say controller or chief accounting officer, who I think would be great, especially given the research, Mark, that you talked about in terms of the accounting background, is not being invited that much. And so when I hear people talk about the difficulty of getting really good people onto audit committees of mid-sized companies, I think of people like this individual. I think of all the partners who are retiring every year at 58 or whatever ridiculously young age you guys are required to retire at.
Be careful, Bob Moritz just showed up. He's in the back.
Hey, Bob. And so there's a lot of talent, I think, to serve on these audit committees. So I'm curious for you maybe to flesh it out.
Yeah, there absolutely is a lot of talent. I spend, in part of my day job is to find directors for boards. The issue, I think, is one, we talk about the expectation gap in accounting. There's an expectation gap in directorships as well, because small and mid-sized companies want A-level players. They want the CEOs, they want the CFOs, they want people that have, that serve as C-suite executives in, Fortune, 250 companies. They are sorely disappointed when you bring them a slate of candidates that are such as the gentleman that you had described, and that they might not be able to get somebody that served at Walmart to sit on their board. And so there is indeed an expectation gap between on small and mid-sized companies in terms of the attractiveness. And there are fabulous people out there that are perfectly capable of serving in director roles, not only financial executives, but diverse individuals, women executives. And it's hard as heck to get them placed on boards of any size.
Yeah, so the problem is the purchase order, the way that's written.
Yes,
You know,
good way,
and
yes.
it's consistently, to Michelle's point, the way she said, and then it's perpetuated by the search firms who specialize in this. They tend to come up with the same old names. So but it's all about board diversity and being able to open the aperture to more qualified people and getting chairs and nominating governance committees to see that they can't all have the same 250 CEOs who aren't available anyway.
All right, I knew that there would be no shortage of conversation with this group. So I appreciate the time. We're eating into the lunch hour now, so it is now time for us to
Margot's
break.
going like this in the back.
And so
So thank you so much for a very, very provocative panel. And so you've given us a lot to think about as we eat lunch, and then we're going to have our brainstorming session. So join me in thanking Trent, Bob, Mark, Michelle, and Brian.